Jonas Walker woke to the pale gray light of a Wyoming winter morning filtering through the slats of his bedroom blinds. The air was thin, almost brittle, carrying the faint scent of frost from the Shoshone forest that bordered his property. Rusty, his aging golden retriever, lay curled at the foot of the bed, tail occasionally flicking in sleep. Jonas moved quietly, careful not to disturb the fragile stillness. The rhythm of his morning ritual grounding him in a life he had built with hands weathered from years of fence posts. Hay bales and soil turned under the weight of labor. There was a tension in the air, though subtle, something that had been threading itself through the last few weeks. It began as a whisper in his chest, a hollow echo of unease he could neither name nor shake. A fence gate left ajar, a missing tool, a shadow on the edge of the tree line that didn't belong. These small, almost imperceptible fissures had begun to puncture the calm armor he carried daily. Jonas had always been careful, methodical, a man who prided himself on knowing every inch of his land. Yet that morning, as he sipped his coffee, watching the steam curl into the cold air, he felt the first subtle pang of fear that maybe, just maybe, something was slipping beyond his control. The town of Cody had a rhythm of its own. Dusty streets, old lamplights flickering against snow-dusted rooftops, neighbors exchanging nods but rarely secrets. Jonas was a familiar figure there, a constant in a place where routines were a lifeline against the unpredictable West. But even constants could falter. He carried quietly a set of anxieties he shared with no one. The fear that one day, all the years of steadfast effort, of waking before dawn to mend fences and care for livestock, could unravel in an instant. On this particular morning, he lingered on the small victories that had shaped his life. A section of fence that had held through last night's storm. Rusty, his loyal companion, nudging him with the gentle insistence of familiarity. The soft golden glow of sunrise across snow-laden fields. Yet beneath it all, a shadow pressed at the edges of his mind, a sense of vulnerability that had begun to seep into his carefully ordered days. Memories he had never spoken of surfaced quietly. A childhood winter when his father had fallen from a barn loft, a fleeting heartbreak he had tucked away, the gnawing sensation of dreams postponed in favor of survival and duty. Jonas' family noticed the subtle shifts too, though they mistook them for fatigue. His mother, the way she lingered by the kitchen door, calling his name softly, sensing the hesitation in his responses. His sister, brushing snow from the porch railing, watching him with a quiet, unspoken concern. They felt the pull of worry, but Jonas wore his composure like armor, unaware that sometimes the strongest walls could hide the deepest tremors. Even Rusty seemed attuned to the tension. Standing a little too long by the edge of the forest, ears pricked, sensing a disturbance that Jonas could not yet name. The dog's unease mirrored his own, a silent companion in the undercurrent of worry that threaded the morning. Jonas felt the weight of that unspoken understanding, the eerie alignment of instinct and fear, and it pressed against the routine he relied on to anchor himself. As he mounted his truck to inspect a stretch of fencing along the property's northern border, Jonas caught sight of something in the woods, a fleeting shimmer of movement. Almost imperceptible, like the forest itself was breathing differently. He paused, listening to the whisper of wind through bare branches, the distant clatter of a gate swinging in the cold. His chest tightened, but he shook the feeling off, attributing it to the early hour and overactive imagination. Yet the seed had been planted, the subtle hint of danger that would soon swell into something uncontainable. Jonas' life was full of quiet routines and unspoken joys, the careful maintenance of equipment, the slow rhythmic work of fencing cattle, the small victories of harvest and repair. But even within this life, shadowed memories lingered. He remembered nights alone in the farmhouse, the creak of floorboards amplifying the silence, imagining conversations that never happened. He thought of friends long gone, of promises made and broken in fleeting youth, and of the unshakable desire to protect the life he had carved from the rugged land. These were the private moments, the emotional landscapes no one else would ever fully see. And yet, despite the subtle anxiety threading through his days, there was hope. Jonas dreamed quietly of a future where his family could thrive, where Rusty could run without limitation across the snow-dusted fields, where the fences he built were not just physical boundaries, but symbols of stability and care. But hope, as he would soon learn, has a fragile edge, and the calm of a Wyoming morning can quickly be overtaken by shadows no man can anticipate. That morning, as Jonas tightened the latch on a gate and adjusted the wire strands, he felt a small pang of unease, a reminder that even the familiar carries risks unseen. Somewhere beyond the tree line, the forest seemed to whisper secrets it would not yet reveal. Jonah's heart carried both the weight of history and the fragile anticipation of an ordinary day, unaware that the ordinary was about to shatter, and with it, the sense of security he had spent a lifetime cultivating. The wind carried the scent of pine and frost, and Rusty padded along the fence line, faithful, alert, sensing his companion's tension. And Jonas, standing in the soft light of a Wyoming sunrise, could not yet imagine how swiftly life could unravel. A small misstep, a fleeting moment of vulnerability, would soon ripple through the town of Cody, leaving echoes of fear, loss, and unanswered questions that would linger for decades. Where are you watching from tonight, and what time is it there? Jonas Walker's days were an intricate choreography of responsibility and care, each movement deliberate, each decision weighed against the unforgiving demands of ranch life. The smell of hay and earth clung to him as naturally as the wind that swept across the Shoshone forest. Morning chores dictated his rhythm, feeding the cattle, checking fence lines, repairing gates, and ensuring that every post stood firm against the elements. Each action was familiar, comforting in its predictability. Yet beneath the surface, Jonas carried an invisible weight, a collection of private worries and quiet longings that few could glimpse. He lived in the farmhouse his family had built decades before, a structure that creaked with every step, full of the warm, lingering scent of wood and years of human presence. In the kitchen, the worn tabletop bore stains and scratches from generations of hands, a testament to the permanence of family, yet also a mirror of the impermanence of moments. Jonas often lingered over his morning coffee, tracing the grain of the wood as if reading it for reassurance, for hints of continuity in a life that could, in a single instant, shift from order to chaos. His family's presence anchored him. His mother, whose soft voice carried years of quiet endurance, often watched him as he moved through his routines, sensing the subtle shifts in his mood. Jonah's sister, a fixture of steadfast affection, brought small comforts, a pie cooling on a windowsill, a letter tucked into his pocket without explanation, a shared look that spoke volumes. And Rusty, always by his side, seemed to understand the nuances of his emotions, the low hum of worry in Jonas' chest. The bond he shared with his dog was an unspoken dialogue, a rhythm of understanding that brought a measure of peace to otherwise restless days. Yet, Jonas' emotional life was not solely defined by these comforting routines. There were fissures beneath the surface, small but persistent. Nights alone in the farmhouse often carried a haunting echo of solitude. He would sit by the window, listening to the wind sift through the forest, letting his mind wander to memories he had tucked away. The ache of childhood loss, the quiet heartache of dreams deferred, the gnawing sense that even the life he had built might not be enough to protect him or those he loved. These were thoughts he never voiced, fears he folded into the corners of his mind like carefully stored tools. Jonas had dreams that extended beyond the fences and fields, though they were modest, quietly held. He imagined Rusty running free through wide expanses of untouched land, of family gatherings that stretched into the warm glow of twilight, of a future where safety and stability were constants, not fragile illusions. But these visions were tinged with caution. He understood the precariousness of rural life, the way a single misstep, a broken fence, a lost animal, a stranger on the edge of his land, could unravel weeks of labor and security. It was a subtle anxiety, always present, threading its way through the fabric of his daily existence. Interactions in Cody were cordial but measured. Jonas was known as a steady hand, reliable and respectful. Yet he did not fully let anyone close to the vulnerability he carried within. There were no public displays of fear or doubt. His emotional landscape was hidden behind the calm, confident exterior of a man who knew the land as well as he knew himself. But in those private moments, he wrestled with small anxieties. The worry that he could not protect his family, the fear that the world held dangers he could not foresee, the lingering echo of loss that life had handed him in fragments. He often reflected on the quiet joys of his life, those small moments that sustained him through the hardships. The smell of leather and wood as he repaired harnesses, the warmth of Rusty's fur against his leg during a snowy morning walk, the distant sound of cattle lowing in the field. These simple experiences were profound, grounding him in the present while reminding him of all he stood to lose. Yet even these joys carried a faint undertone of impermanence. Every familiar sound, every comforting texture, was shadowed by the unspoken understanding that life could shift abruptly, leaving nothing more than silence and memory. Jonas' emotional terrain was further complicated by the subtle pressures of the town itself. In Cody, everyone knew everyone else, and the lives of the residents were woven together in delicate, sometimes fragile, patterns. Observations, whispered concerns, fleeting glances, all carried meaning. Jonas felt the weight of being known, yet not fully understood. There was a quiet isolation in this duality, a solitude that clung to him even amidst the familiarity of neighbors and friends. The emotional labor of carrying both connection and concealment weighed heavily, a burden Jonas bore without complaint. The routine of his work offered a fragile sense of control over an otherwise unpredictable existence. Each fence post, each repaired gate, each mile walked through the snowy fields was an affirmation of mastery over his environment, a silent rebellion against the chaos that sometimes lurked beyond the visible. But emotional control was far less tangible than physical labor. Jonas' inner life, his quiet fears, small hopes, and lingering insecurities remained largely unshared, a landscape as wild and untamed as the Shoshone forest itself. Evenings brought their own complexities. The light would soften over the horizon, casting long shadows across the barn and pasture, and Jonas would find himself lingering over minor tasks, avoiding the creeping stillness that followed him into the house. He would examine tools, tally supplies, or mend fences he had already fixed, seeking distraction from the quiet unease that had begun to take root. Rusty would nudge him insistently, reminding him of the world outside his spiraling thoughts, offering companionship that was loyal and unwavering. In the rare moments of reflection, Jonas allowed himself glimpses of his vulnerability. He remembered the times when he felt unseen, the small disappointments he never spoke aloud, the unfulfilled longing for reassurance that perhaps, despite his solitude, someone could truly understand the intricate emotional terrain he navigated each day. These were not dramatic revelations, but subtle, persistent currents, the hum of humanity beneath the exterior of a man defined by diligence and resilience. In his home, in his work, in his relationships, Jonas Walker carried a quiet, weighty humanity. It was this humanity that would make the events to come not just a story of disappearance or crime, but a profound narrative of vulnerability, loss, and the fragile beauty of ordinary life interrupted by forces beyond comprehension. He was not a hero in the cinematic sense, nor a figure of myth. He was deeply human, painfully aware of his limitations, quietly holding space for love, fear, and hope in equal measure. And in this careful, deliberate existence, the threads of his emotional life wove a tapestry that was as much about survival as it was about longing. Every action, every thought, every quiet gesture carried with it the weight of a man who knew the value of his life and the precariousness of its preservation. This emotional depth, this private intensity, would become the lens through which the world would later view the unraveling of a life that seemed ordinary, yet was anything but. And if stories like this keep you pulled in, make sure you're subscribed so you never miss what comes next. The final days of Jonas Walker's life unfolded with the quiet, almost imperceptible shift of a winter storm approaching from the horizon. On the surface, he continued his meticulous routines, inspecting fences at dawn, walking Rusty along the perimeter of the property, checking the water troughs, and tending to the livestock. But beneath the exterior of steadiness, a subtle tension had begun to embed itself deeper, like frost creeping under the siding of a weathered barn. Small irregularities, a gate that didn't latch properly, footprints in the snow that weren't his own, a shadow that seemed to linger longer than it should, planted seeds of unease that he could not yet articulate, let alone share. Jonas moved with the same careful precision he always had, yet each step seemed to carry an added weight, a quiet hesitation in his gait that even Rusty seemed to notice. The dog's ears twitched at every rustle in the tree line, and when Jonas called his name, there was a brief pause before Rusty responded, as if he too were attuned to the subtle shifts in the forest atmosphere. The cold Wyoming wind bit at Jonas' face as he traversed the northern pastures, and he felt it not just on his skin, but on his conscience. A chill that seemed to whisper of vulnerabilities lurking beyond the edge of sight. Evenings, once a refuge of warmth and reflection, grew restless. The farmhouse, with its familiar wooden floors and muted scent of pine and stove smoke, felt larger than it had before, the silence more pronounced. Jonas would sit by the window long after the day's work was done, staring out at the Shoshone forest that stretched into darkness. His mind traced the familiar tree line, but now it lingered on the gaps, the shadows, the places where movement seemed unnatural. His chest tightened in moments of sudden, inexplicable anxiety, fleeting pangs that were quickly rationalized away by reason. Routine and habit had left an imprint that lingered long into the night. In these last days, Jonas' emotional landscape oscillated between diligence and subtle dread. He thought of his family often, the small comforts they provided, the warmth of shared meals, the unspoken understanding that had always existed between them. But he also carried memories and insecurities unspoken, a fear of failing in ways that could not be measured by fence lines or livestock counts, the quiet wish to be fully understood, and yet the certainty that some truths would remain his alone. These internal battles were silent, private, and persistent, threading through the ordinary actions of his life, casting shadows over even the sunniest moments. There were brief interactions with neighbors that seemed ordinary, but were tinged with an uncharacteristic edge of tension. Jonas had always been observant, aware of patterns and subtle anomalies, and now those instincts were sharper, more insistent. He noticed a truck idling longer than expected near the forest edge, a gate swinging open in the wind, but in a direction that made no sense. Footprints that seemed unfamiliar in their pattern. Each observation was catalogued internally, quietly analyzed, and dismissed with a cautious hope that perhaps the world was still orderly. That danger was only a whisper, not a tangible threat. Sleep, once a refuge, became fragmented. Jonas would awaken in the pre-dawn hours, a tightness in his chest, Rusty stirring beside him as if sharing in the silent worry. Shadows in corners of the room seemed to move with a consciousness of their own, and the creak of the floorboards in the hallway took on a sharper, more ominous cadence. Yet Jonas met each day with his habitual calm, concealing the growing apprehension under layers of responsibility and familiarity. His outward appearance was still that of the reliable rancher, steady, capable, unshakable, even as the quiet anxiety threaded through the marrow of his bones. He began leaving small markers of his intentions, subtle adjustments to routines he had long taken for granted, double-checking gates that had never failed, ensuring doors were locked even when the weather was mild, scanning the tree line more vigilantly during his daily walks. These actions were not dramatic, not visible to anyone else, but they were symptomatic of the quiet escalation of fear within him, a preparation for contingencies that he hoped would never need to be enacted. The people who loved him sensed the change, though they could not define it. His sister remarked on the way he lingered at the kitchen table, lost in thought. His mother noticed the tension in his hands as he handled tools, a slight tremor when he carried heavy objects. Even Rusty, who had been Jonas' unwavering companion through countless years of toil and quiet joys, pressed close in a protective, almost anxious pattern. It was the kind of subtle signaling that only those intimately connected could perceive. The emotional barometer of a life beginning to sense impending fracture. There were moments of reflection, too, where Jonas allowed himself a rare vulnerability. He imagined futures that would never come to pass. Long, peaceful evenings with his family gathered in the farmhouse, Rusty chasing unseen rabbits across snowy fields, the gentle satisfaction of work completed and life uninterrupted. Each thought was tinged with the awareness of fragility, an understanding that even the smallest disturbance could ripple through the carefully structured life he had built. These private reflections carried a weight, a quiet premonition of loss that he could not yet fully articulate, but that lingered persistently in his consciousness. And then, amidst the rhythm of chores, meals, and solitary reflection, the subtle tension that had been threading through Jonas' life began to manifest in ways that were more than instinct. A sense of being watched, fleeting glimpses of movement just beyond the periphery of vision, and a tightening in the chest that no amount of routine could dissipate. The Shoshone Forest, once a familiar boundary and friend, now seemed to him both protector and threat, a place where danger could be hidden in plain sight, waiting for the slightest misstep. The final days were a delicate interplay of normalcy and disruption, a slow unraveling of the sense of safety that Jonas had cultivated for years. Each dawn carried the possibility of catastrophe, yet he moved through the day with the practiced ease of someone who had survived countless winters and challenges. The emotional unease was subtle but unrelenting, a tension that made even ordinary actions feel heavy with consequence. And as Jonas Walker walked among his fences and fields, tending to the life he had so carefully built, the undercurrent of fear whispered to him from the edges of the forest. Each step, each glance, each moment of quiet reflection carried the weight of anticipation, the unspoken dread that something irrevocable was approaching. A moment when the ordinary would shatter and the steady world he had known would collapse into silence and loss. The morning Jonas Walker disappeared began unremarkably, yet the air carried an unusual stillness, as if the Shoshone Forest itself were holding its breath. The wind, normally sharp and insistent, whispered lazily through skeletal trees, moving only enough to shift the snow atop fence posts. Jonas walked along the northern pasture, Rusty trailing close, ears alert, tail low but swishing in uncertain rhythm. There was a faint unease threading through him, an instinct he had learned to respect but often rationalized. That day, the instinct gnawed more insistently, like a cold hand brushing at the back of his neck. He moved systematically, checking gates, mending a loose wire, tracing the lines of the fence with hands that knew every knot and spike. The forest bordered his land like a living wall, its shadowed depths familiar yet unreadable. Jonas' gaze drifted frequently toward it, the pine boughs rustling as if in conversation, the brown and white trunk swaying with quiet deliberation. A fleeting thought crossed his mind. What if something had changed here, imperceptibly but irreversibly? He shook the notion away. There was work to be done, cattle to tend, fences to secure. Still, the feeling lingered, a whisper that would not be silenced. Hours passed in the rhythm of chores, punctuated by the occasional call of Rusty or the distant hum of a pickup on the nearby road. Jonas paused by a gate, inspecting the latch, and noticed footprints in the snow that did not match his own or Rusty's. They were deliberate, heavy, moving along the tree line, yet stopping and shifting in ways that suggested hesitation. He frowned, scanning the edge of the forest, muscles tensing as a low awareness crawled through his chest. Whoever had passed this way had been careful, aware of his routines, but the purpose remained inscrutable. He left a subtle mark on the gate latch as a mental note, returning to his work, hoping the unease was nothing more than overactive imagination. The hours edged closer to late afternoon. Jonas made his way to the far corner of the property, where the fence met the dense thickets of the forest. He adjusted the wire, careful to avoid snapping it, and paused to catch his breath, surveying the expanse of snow-covered ground. Rusty wandered ahead briefly before circling back, nose to the cold earth. The quiet was almost absolute, broken only by the low whistle of wind through bare branches. Yet beneath the serenity lay something unnameable, a tension that twisted beneath the normalcy of a rancher's day. Jonas' mind wandered to private concerns, things he seldom shared. There had been minor thefts reported on neighboring properties, reports of strange lights in the woods at night, accounts dismissed by locals as pranks or overactive imaginations. He had always believed in reason and methodical problem-solving, yet today, a fissure opened in that certainty. He could not ignore the tracks he had seen, nor the inexplicable chill that pricked his skin as he worked. Each instinct he had honed over decades whispered of intrusion, of boundaries crossed, of danger close yet unseen. By late afternoon, the light was dimming, casting long shadows across the fields, stretching the fence lines into slanted patterns of black and gray. Jonas returned to the farmhouse briefly, taking a moment to check supplies and water for the animals. He moved with a quiet efficiency, avoiding idle contemplation, though a low hum of apprehension thrummed in his chest. Rusty stayed at his heels, sensing the subtle strain, tail flicking nervously, ears swiveling at every minor sound. Then, as the sun dipped lower, Jonas walked toward the edge of the property, near a small copse of trees where the snow was deeper, untouched by recent activity. The footprints were clearer now, showing a pattern, a presence deliberate and watchful. Jonas' senses sharpened. Someone had been observing him, perhaps even tracking his movements across the day. His heart quickened, the rhythm irregular in a way that alarmed him. Rusty growled softly, low in his throat, a warning barely audible over the whispering wind. Jonas moved carefully, scanning the line between pasture and forest. The trees swayed with quiet menace, casting deep, moving shadows. He called Rusty to heel, keeping him close, and surveyed the surroundings. The forest, usually a friend and boundary, felt alien now, a place where concealment could mask intent. His instincts screamed caution, urging him to return to the farmhouse, to lock doors, to secure the perimeter. But the pull of curiosity, of obligation, kept him lingering at the threshold. It was there, at the edge of familiarity and unknown, that the rupture occurred. The precise sequence remained speculative, a struggle, a fleeting confrontation, or simply the overwhelming advantage of someone watching, waiting. The order of Jonas' day fractured. The calm rhythms of chores and livestock care collapsed into sudden panic. Rusty barked, alarmed, the sound cutting sharply through the quiet, then silence. Snow lay untouched, except for the irregular tracks that had led to that final space, now abruptly ending, leaving the forest edge still impenetrable. An impossibly quiet dot in those moments, Jonah's world narrowed to a flicker of fear. The sense of control eroding with every heartbeat. The day's labor, the patterns he had perfected, the careful attention to fences and animals, none of it could shield him from the psychological rupture that had taken hold. His final awareness was the fragile grasp of life against an encroaching, incomprehensible force. A sudden collapse of normalcy that left the land and the farmhouse behind as silent witnesses. The town of Cody would not learn immediately. Neighbors noticed the absence only when dusk fell fully and Rusty returned alone, circling the property with anxious, searching steps. The farmhouse, still warm from earlier activity, seemed frozen in time. Doors closed, tools arranged as if waiting for him to return. Yet Jonas Walker was gone, vanished into the edge of forest and shadow, leaving behind an absence that would ripple through the emotional core of his family and community that knew him as a steadfast, reliable presence. The forest held its secrets tightly, and for a time, the quiet reasserted itself over the snow and fence lines. Rusty's low whine filled the space Jonas had left behind, a mournful echo of loss, of rupture, of fear unspoken. The ordinary had shattered, replaced by the intangible tension of disappearance, the kind that lingers in cold air and long shadows, whispering of questions that demand answers yet remain maddeningly out of reach. If you want to know what investigators uncovered next, go ahead and like this video. The first hints of alarm in Cody arrived not with sirens or flashing lights, but with a quiet, creeping dread that seeped into conversations and lingered in doorways. Jonas Walker had not returned that evening, and the rhythm of the town, normally steady, predictable, began to falter. His mother, sitting by the dim light of the kitchen, felt a gnawing unease she could not name. His sister, walking the length of the driveway under the pale glow of moonlight, noticed Rusty pacing, ears pricked, tail low, circling the property in a tension-filled orbit. The subtle indicators of something gone awry multiplied, layering anxiety over the town in ways that ordinary worry could not contain. Investigators arrived the following morning, local deputies accustomed to ranching life and the patterns of small-town Wyoming, yet unprepared for the emotional weight that accompanied this particular case. They moved carefully, methodically, cataloging the property and tracing the paths Jonas had trodden countless times. The fences, once markers of control and mastery, now carried a stark, almost haunting symbolism, the fragility of order in a world poised for disorder. Each gate, each wire, each snow-dusted post became a silent witness, a fragment of a day whose final moments had been stolen by unseen hands. Inside the farmhouse, personal items remained untouched. Coffee mugs on the counter, notes on a table, tools arranged in familiar order. Everything spoke of a routine abruptly halted. Investigators documented each detail meticulously, knowing that in absence, small signs could carry enormous significance. Rusty, restless and mournful, followed every movement, a living testament to the disruption of domestic normalcy. His low whines punctuated the silence, reminding those present that the emotional strain extended far beyond what could be measured in reports or photographs. The town itself was caught between disbelief and rising panic. In Cody, everyone knew Jonas. He had been a fixture of life, steady, reliable, the kind of man whose absence created a dissonance that vibrated through the community. Neighbors spoke, quietly in hushed tones, speculating, wondering how a man so attuned to the land and to his surroundings could vanish without trace. There was a communal recognition of vulnerability, the unsettling realization that even the most careful and skilled individuals were not immune to forces beyond comprehension. Investigators soon identified initial clues, footprints that led to the forest's edge and then abruptly stopped, a displaced fence panel that suggested tampering, and faint impressions in the snow inconsistent with Jonas' known patterns. Each piece of evidence was catalogued and photographed, yet none provided immediate answers. The forest, dense and shadowed, held secrets the law could not yet decipher, a labyrinth of trees and underbrush that swallowed details as efficiently as it had swallowed Jonas. Family members experienced the emotional strain in acute, relentless waves. His mother, previously composed, now found herself staring at the walls, replaying imagined scenarios over and over, a silent torture of unknowing. His sister walked the boundary of the property at irregular hours, eyes scanning shadows, ears straining for sounds of movement, every crack of twigs magnified into possible signals of danger. The emotional impact of uncertainty, of disappearance without resolution, began to stretch the edges of their resilience. Nights became a battlefield of memory and speculation, each thought tinged with fear, hope, and grief simultaneously. Investigators followed leads that ranged from mundane to unsettling. A neighbor reported a stranger in a nearby field days prior, a figure whose description remained vague yet insistent. Surveillance was non-existent in this rural expanse. The authorities relied on observation, deduction, and intuition, moving deliberately through the snow and underbrush. Every decision carried weight. One missed clue could allow a moment of violence to remain hidden indefinitely. The town's atmosphere thickened with apprehension. Local businesses noted absences. Friends asked questions quietly over coffee, and conversations tapered off into uneasy silences. The disappearance had become a communal trauma, a shared anxiety threading through daily life in Cody. People walked more cautiously, locked doors more firmly, and watched the forest edge with a new, vigilant awareness. The ordinary rhythms of life were disrupted, replaced by a pervasive sense of vulnerability that mirrored the private fears Jonas himself had carried. Amid the rising investigative tension, small but significant discoveries began to emerge. Rusty's behavior hinted at patterns unseen by human observers. The dog returned repeatedly to a small cluster of footprints near the tree line, nudging at snow-covered ground in insistence. A broken branch, an indentation in the soil, a faint trace of a scent on the wind. These fragments, collected with painstaking care, formed a puzzle that investigators began to assemble, each piece amplifying the sense of urgency. Yet for every step forward, there was the emotional weight of uncertainty. Families, neighbors, and law enforcement shared a collective strain, a knowledge that the truth might be slower, colder, and harsher than anyone wished to imagine. In Cody, the disappearance of Jonas Walker was not just a procedural investigation. It was a deepening wound in the town's psyche, a disruption of trust and safety, and a stark reminder that even the most resilient lives could fracture under unseen pressures. If you want to know what investigators uncovered next, go ahead and like this video. The years that followed Jonas Walker's disappearance folded into a pattern of absence and speculation, leaving behind a cold case that pressed heavily on the town of Cody. Time, which normally eases the edges of trauma, instead seemed to sharpen them here. Each passing winter, each snow-laden spring, reminded the residents of the abrupt emptiness left in Jonas' absence. The forest he knew so intimately remained impenetrable, a dark boundary between memory and mystery, hiding truths that refused to surface. For his family, the weight of unknowing became a constant companion. His mother, once a quiet pillar of reassurance, now carried a hollowed vigilance. Every morning, she checked the farmhouse doors, each creak of the floor a jarring echo of the day Jonas vanished. His sister mapped invisible trails, replayed the last glimpses and footprints, and imagined scenarios both plausible and impossible. trying to reconcile the ordered life they had known with the chaotic void left behind. Rusty, aged and slower, still lingered near the forest's edge, a living testament to the loyalty that had survived while his companion had not. Investigators returned sporadically, reviewing the evidence, retracing steps, and consulting with specialists in cold case methods that had evolved since 2005. Snowdrifts shifted the terrain, erasing footprints while seasonal winds altered the forest's contours, hiding subtle clues that might have revealed a trace of Jonah's path. Over time, even the landscape itself seemed to conspire with absence, concealing as efficiently as the forest had on that fateful day. The evidence that remained: broken branches, partial tracks, and Rusty's uneasy indications, was frustratingly fragmented, a puzzle where the pieces refused to form a coherent picture. The emotional scars left on those closest to Jonas deepened with each unresolved year. They wrestled with guilt and imagined responsibility, the fleeting what-if thoughts that gnawed at the edges of rationality. Could they have noticed a change in his routines? Should they have questioned the subtle anxieties he had carried? Even ordinary interactions, a casual remark, a paused glance, became potential signs missed, haunting reminders of the unknowable. The silence of the missing stretched long into nights, leaving a residue that seeped into dreams, conversations, every quiet moment. Cody itself felt the tremors. The disappearance of a man so central to its identity disrupted the sense of communal safety. Neighbors avoided the forest at dusk, farmers double-checked fences, and casual conversations carried an undercurrent of dread. People whispered about sightings or the shadow of movement glimpsed through pines. And while nothing concrete ever materialized, the collective anxiety was palpable. The town, once rhythmically self-assured, became a place where every gust of wind or displaced snowflake could hint at an unfinished narrative. An unseen presence died as the seasons passed. Law enforcement remained committed but constrained. Leads went cold, informants moved away, and the occasional rumor proved unsubstantiated. The fragments of evidence, footprints, displaced fences, and subtle traces in the snow became artifacts of a day frozen in time. Yet investigators preserved every detail, aware that cold cases have a cruel patience. Truths often surface decades later, emerging not in the urgency of immediate action, but in the slow, deliberate unraveling of memory and circumstance. Within the fractured emotional landscape of Jonah's family, guilt became a silent shadow. They imagined the choices he might have made, retracing paths through snow and shadow, as if their collective imagination could fill in the gaps left by absence. Each unresolved lead, each dead end, became another layer of grief and tension, tightening the coil of uncertainty that had settled into their lives. Rusty, long past the vigor of youth, remained tethered to these memories, his restless movements a living reminder of what had been lost and what remained, suspended in mystery. The town's residents also began to internalize the disappearance in subtle ways. Farmers, ranchers, and neighbors shared quiet caution in their routines, eyes drifting to tree lines they had once walked without notice. Conversations carried cautionary undertones, and local children were warned against wandering near the forest edge. Jonah's absence became more than an unresolved case. It was a persistent emotional presence, a reminder of the fragility of ordinary life and the invisible threats that could disrupt it. And yet, beneath the tension and grief, there remained an enduring hope, a quiet, stubborn belief that Jonas Walker might still be found, that the forest might one day release its secret. Each detail revisited by investigators, each fresh lead sparked by tipsters or old acquaintances, carried with it the fragile promise of closure, however delayed. For his family, each small potential breakthrough was a double-edged sword, a flicker of hope tempered by the emotional toll of imagined outcomes that could never be realized If you could tell someone what really happened all those years ago, who would you speak to first? After nearly a decade of silence, the first threads of breakthrough began to unravel the tightly wound mystery surrounding Jonas Walker. It came quietly, not in a sudden revelation or dramatic discovery, but through patient persistence, a neighbor recalling a fleeting detail from the day Jonas disappeared, an overlooked report dusted off and re-examined, a pattern emerging in footprints and snowdrifts once thought irrelevant. The forest, which had swallowed both man and truth for years, seemed at last to yield the faintest whisper of the story it had guarded so fiercely. Investigators revisited the northern pasture where Jonas had last been seen. The remnants of evidence, long faded into seasonal cycles of snow and thaw, were reinterpreted with new methods. Forensic specialists trained in cold cases examined soil disturbances and tree bark abrasions. Scent tracking units reanalyzed old data, and digital reconstructions of the terrain revealed subtle inconsistencies in the paths Jonas had likely taken. The technical scrutiny breathed life into details that had seemed static, revealing a narrative almost invisible to the human eye. The breakthrough gained momentum when a retired rancher, who had once assisted Jonas with fence repairs, came forward with recollections that had lingered unspoken for years. He described seeing a figure near the forest edge on the morning of the disappearance, a man whose presence was subtle but deliberate, someone familiar with both the land and the routines of those who lived there. The description was vague, yet the timing and location aligned with the remaining evidence, breathing new possibility into an investigation that had seemed stalled in the relentless passage of time. For Jonas' family, the revelation was both devastating and oddly relieving. Decades of suspended grief had calcified into a quiet, haunting presence in their lives. The acknowledgement that the story was beginning to take shape forced them to confront emotions long contained: hope, fear, sorrow, and the raw ache of remembering every subtle signal they had noticed but dismissed. Rusty was no longer alive to guide them, but the dog's absence only intensified the emotional gravity of the moment, a reminder of all the years lived in shadow. Waiting for truth, investigators began to piece together a sequence: the footprints that had been recorded in snow, previously dismissed as random or environmental, now revealed patterns of pursuit and evasion. Displaced fence panels suggested not just accidental disturbance, but deliberate, calculated entry and exit. Shadows along the tree line were no longer abstract threats. They became elements of a slowly emerging narrative, a choreography of human intent previously hidden within the forest's embrace. Each discovery sharpened the focus, cutting through years of speculation and rumor. Town residents, who had carried a collective anxiety for years, felt the subtle shift. Conversations resumed around the dim light of diners and in quiet stores, whispers now tinged with cautious optimism. There was acknowledgement that the mystery, frozen in memory and speculation, was beginning to breathe again. And yet, the weight of truth was not lighter. If anything, it pressed harder. The reality of what had transpired finally coming into focus demanded a confrontation with the very fears the town had carefully skirted for years. One of the most profound moments came when someone close to Jonas finally spoke. A distant cousin who had been aware of minor, overlooked signs leading up to the disappearance. Their recollection added a layer of clarity, a piece of human intuition that formal investigation alone could not achieve. Memories long tucked away, subtle observations, and the quiet persistence of recollection combined with evidence to form a narrative no longer confined to speculation. It was a long-buried truth, fragile and human, now emerging from the emotional sediment of time. For the investigators, the breakthrough demanded patience. Evidence had to be corroborated, footprints and traces cross-referenced with the landscape and seasonal changes. Each step forward was tentative, measured, aware that decades of absence had warped memory and altered perception. The forest, which had seemed impenetrable, was gradually yielding, revealing a choreography of movement and decision that spoke to both strategy and desperation. Every detail confirmed or revised the story, gradually forming a tapestry that was human, deliberate, and tragic. For the family, the emotional intensity of this stage was overwhelming. Long-suppressed grief returned with force, a tidal wave of mourning for what had been lost and for every year spent in liminal space. Yet intertwined with the pain was a fragile relief, confirmation that the mystery was not endless, that their recollections, suspicions, and quiet fears had been valid all along. The unearthing of long-concealed truths carried both the sting of loss and the relief of eventual understanding, a duality that marked the deep emotional landscape of the breakthrough. The town of Cody, accustomed to a slow-burn unease, now felt the piercing clarity of revelation. Where once there had been fog and shadow, details began to solidify. Who had been near the Walker property that day? The sequence of movements and the subtle decisions that had culminated in Jonah's disappearance. The forest, patient and silent, had finally begun to relinquish its secrets, and in the midst of this unfolding, the question hung in the air, pressing at the hearts of those who had carried silence for years. If you could tell someone what really happened all those years ago, who would you speak to first? The revelation struck with a quiet inevitability, a truth that had been gestating in shadow for years, finally surfacing with painful clarity. Investigators, armed with new evidence and corroborated memories, began to reconstruct the final hours of Jonas Walker's life with meticulous care. The forest that had long been a boundary between certainty and speculation now became a map of deliberate movement. Footprints, broken branches, and subtle traces of human intent coalesced into a narrative of confrontation, pursuit, and eventual abduction. Every detail, however small, resonated with the weight of finality, slicing through decades of silence like a cold, sharp wind. For his family, the revelation was both a release and an agony. The uncertainty that had permeated every aspect of daily life, the small rituals of grief, the anxious vigilance over the property, the silent nights haunted by imagination, was replaced by the brutal clarity of what had occurred. Jonas had not simply vanished. He had been overpowered, his routines anticipated, his skills and knowledge of the land insufficient against the calculated intent of another. The emotional impact was seismic, reverberating through memories long held in quiet tension, reshaping grief into understanding, sorrow into a painful, human comprehension of cruelty and loss. The town of Cody felt the shock differently, but no less intensely. Residents who had walked the same trails as Jonas, who had once glimpsed him in the fields or at fences, now imagined the calculated presence of another human being moving in parallel to his world, tracing his steps and waiting in silence. The forest, a friend and familiar boundary, became a witness to the meticulous dismantling of a life that had once been defined by self-sufficiency and intimate knowledge of terrain. Every neighbor who had speculated quietly for years now confronted the real, horrifying mechanisms behind the disappearance. Investigators detailed the sequence with precision. The footprints in the snow, initially dismissed as inconsequential, revealed a methodical approach, a trail converging on Jonas' usual path, halting and diverting in patterns suggestive of observation, misdirection, and strategy. Disturbed fence posts and bent wire indicated someone with experience of ranch life, someone who understood the rhythm and routines of those who worked the land. Each detail etched the portrait of human intention against the backdrop of the untamed forest. A collision of mastery and vulnerability that had once seemed inconceivable. For Jonas' family, every revelation brought a fresh layer of grief. The intimacy of his daily life, his rituals, his attentiveness to Rusty, his quiet moments of reflection became painful reference points against the stark violence of circumstance. They recalled the subtle tensions of the last days, the footprints he had noticed, the fleeting sense of being watched, the cold edge of unease threading through his routines. What had seemed like minor anxieties now took on the weight of premonition, tragic markers of awareness that he could not articulate to those around him. The evidence also revealed the psychological calculus of his disappearance. Jonah's familiarity with the land had made him a formidable presence in the open. Yet in moments of vulnerability, those same intimate patterns could be anticipated and manipulated. The forest, once a shield and boundary, had become a stage for the unseen, its shadows and quiet paths exploited to render him powerless. The realization that such precise, deliberate planning had been at work unsettled both the investigators and the family, highlighting the fragility of safety in a world where knowledge alone cannot always protect. Community members, who had long carried a quiet anxiety, now confronted the emotional fallout of knowing the truth. Their reflections, whispered over coffee and at the edge of fields, merged with collective grief and empathy. The abstract fear of what could have happened crystallized into a human, visceral comprehension of the violence that had intruded into a life they had all once regarded as ordinary, dependable, and protected. The emotional landscape shifted. Lingering dread gave way to mourning. Speculation gave way to tangible reality. Even the smallest artifacts carried immense significance. Rusty's return alone to the property, the placement of personal items in the farmhouse, and the subtle signs of struggle along the fence line became vivid symbols of loss and survival. Each object, each mark, each trace was now understood in context, a fragment of the story that could finally be pieced together, however painfully. The ordinary, familiar world of Cody, the farmhouse, the pastures, the wind through the pines, was irrevocably altered by the knowledge of what had transpired. The shadow of human intent cutting through the quiet American landscape with precision and cruelty. And for Jonah's family, the revelation also carried an unanticipated sense of closure, however partial. The questions that had haunted them for years, where he had gone, what had happened, why no one had returned him, were now replaced by the painful but definitive answers. The grief remained, the longing persisted, and the silence of lost time could not be retrieved. Yet the truth, finally visible after years of obscurity, allowed a confrontation with reality that had been impossible for decades. The Shoshone forest, which had held its secret for so long, had yielded its story. And within that emergence, the emotional fallout, the blend of sorrow, understanding, and human reckoning reshaped the collective memory of Jonas Walker, a man whose life had been ordinary in its patterns, yet extraordinary in its depth, suddenly illuminated in tragic clarity. The final unraveling of Jonas Walker's story came not with a single, dramatic revelation, but through the painstaking layering of evidence, testimony, and memory. Each fragment, previously isolated and seemingly inconsequential, now formed a coherent narrative, sharp and devastating in its clarity. The forest that had swallowed him for so long revealed the choreography of human intention, the sequence of actions that had disrupted decades of routine and shattered the calm rhythms of his life. It was a narrative both intimate and horrifying, a collision of ordinary diligence and calculated intrusion that no one had anticipated. For his family, the emotional intensity of this stage was almost unbearable. The subtle markers they had long remembered, footprints, rusted gates, and fleeting shadows, now carried definitive weight. Every recalled detail, every private anxiety Jonas had held, every moment of unease in his final days, was validated in the harsh light of truth. Grief intertwined with relief, creating a complex tapestry of emotion. Sorrow for the life violently interrupted. Understanding for the instincts he had trusted but could not fully act upon. And a quiet satisfaction that his disappearance was no longer a riddle. Left unresolved, investigators detailed the final sequence with methodical precision. Jonas had been confronted near the forest's edge, the familiar patterns of his ranching routines exploited by someone who knew them well. Every subtle movement, every predictable action he took in maintaining his land had been anticipated and manipulated. The evidence painted a chilling portrait of predation, deliberate, strategic, and human. The forest, once a boundary of familiarity, had become a stage where vulnerability met intention, where knowledge alone could not shield a man from danger. The town of Cody absorbed the revelation with a mixture of horror and reflection. Residents revisited the past through the lens of newfound clarity, reinterpreting long-held memories. The stranger glimpsed near the property, the faint signs of intrusion, the peculiar behavior of neighbors or passers-by. The town's collective consciousness, previously suspended in anxious speculation, now confronted the stark reality of human intention woven into the quiet landscape they had all known. The ordinary world had been penetrated by something calculated and cruel, and recognition of that truth reshaped the community's emotional architecture. For Jonas' family, each step of the unraveling brought both closure and renewed grief. The farmhouse, still intact with its familiar smells and wormwood, became a repository of memory, each room a shrine to ordinary life interrupted. Rusty's absence, painfully felt in those final reconstructions, underscored the finality of loss, the irrevocable fracture in the routine that had once provided comfort. Yet alongside sorrow, there was also recognition. Jonas' vigilance, his careful observation of the land, and his quiet awareness of subtle danger had been real and meaningful. If ultimately insufficient against forces beyond his control, investigators continued to cross-reference data, reconstruct paths, and confirm details through forensic methods and witness testimony. Each confirmation solidified the narrative, the calculated intrusion, the precise anticipation of Jonas' actions, the methods employed to isolate and overpower him. Even small details, like the arrangement of tools or the disruption of fence lines, revealed a chilling level of premeditation. The forest and surrounding land, so familiar to Jonas, had been transformed into an arena of control and surveillance. And the truth of that transformation was undeniable. Emotionally, the unraveling reshaped long-held perceptions of the victim and the community. Jonas was no longer simply a missing man. He was a figure whose life, decisions, and emotional depth became visible in the context of human vulnerability and resilience. The narrative illuminated his quiet fears, his attentiveness to family and land, and the subtle anxiety that had marked his last days. His humanity, once shadowed by absence, now shone in relief and sorrow, rendering the tragedy more immediate, intimate, and devastating. The forest, once opaque and unknowable, had been forced to yield its truth. Investigators traced the path, mapped the evidence, and reconstructed the intentions of another human being who had manipulated Jonas' routines to devastating effect. The quiet presence of malevolence, hidden for years, was now visible in stark relief, a reminder of how ordinary life can be disrupted by deliberate cruelty. For the community and family alike, the revelation demanded confrontation with the darkest edges of human behavior, forcing an emotional reckoning long deferred in the final stages. The emotional landscape reached its peak. The grief of loss, the relief of clarity, the horror of calculated violence, and the enduring admiration for Jonas' diligence and character combined into a powerful human tableau. His life, once taken for granted in its ordinary rhythms, was now understood in all its depth. Careful, observant, emotionally rich, and tragically fragile. The culmination of years of investigation and reflection left behind a mixture of closure and ongoing resonance. The town of Cody, Jonas' family, and even the land itself bore the imprint of this slow burn tragedy, a reminder of vulnerability, resilience, and the fragile thread of human existence. Every fence post, every snowy field, every whisper of wind through the Shoshone forest now carried the memory of Jonas Walker, a life abruptly interrupted but profoundly remembered. In the quiet aftermath, Cody slowly began to absorb the weight of truth. The forest, once a domain of mystery and dread, had finally offered its reluctant testimony. The patterns of snow, the trace of footprints, the displacement of fences, and the memories of witnesses all converged into a coherent, tragic narrative. Jonas Walker, a man defined by diligence, careful observation, and emotional depth, had been overpowered by calculated human intent. The realization brought closure, yet the emotional resonance lingered like the echo of wind through the pines, stubborn and haunting. For his family, the years of uncertainty transformed into a different kind of grief, one that was no longer suspended in doubt, but grounded in clarity. They revisited the farmhouse with measured steps, tracing familiar paths, noting the tools Jonas had once handled, and acknowledging the spaces once filled with his presence. Rusty's absence, now absolute, served as a living reminder of loyalty and loss. The emotional landscape of the Walker family remained rugged and uneven. Yet the revelation allowed them to grieve with knowledge rather than speculation, to honor memory rather than chase shadows. Cody itself began to reconcile with the story. The town's rhythms returned, but with a subtle shift, an acute awareness of fragility, a cautious attentiveness to routines previously taken for granted. Neighbors who had once whispered of unseen threats or fleeting figures now spoke openly of the resolved mystery, sharing memories and reflections of Jonas as a man who had carried both vulnerability and quiet strength. The town, shaped by the slow accumulation of grief and tension, absorbed the resolution with a tempered recognition. Ordinary life is precious precisely because it can be disrupted in a single, unanticipated moment. Jonas' life, reconstructed through evidence and testimony, revealed the depth of his humanity. His attentiveness to the land, his bond with Rusty, his subtle internal anxieties, and the care he invested in family and community all became visible through the prism of tragedy. The ordinary tasks he had performed for years, mending fences, feeding livestock, walking the perimeter of his property, now resonated with both endurance and fragility. Every action, previously unnoticed in the flow of routine, became an emblem of a life lived with care, intelligence, and quiet, emotional complexity. The emotional closure carried a paradoxical mixture of relief and sorrow. The question of what had happened was answered, yet the answer was steeped in the irrevocable reality of violence and loss. For those who loved him, understanding did not lessen the ache. It sharpened it, aligning memory with fact, grief with comprehension. The story, once suspended in ambiguity, could finally be spoken, documented, and integrated into collective memory. But the emotional imprint remained indelible, a permanent trace in the hearts of those who had known and loved Jonas. Investigators reflected on the case not merely as a resolution of fact, but as a study of human resilience and vulnerability. Jonas' disappearance had been meticulously planned. Yet the slow uncovering of truth revealed both the fragility of ordinary life and the enduring capacity of memory, observation, and persistence to illuminate what had once been hidden. The forest, patient and silent for years, had revealed a narrative that was profoundly human. Ordinary life interrupted, subtle vigilance tested, and emotional depth exposed to forces beyond control. For the Walker family, the process of moving forward involved integrating memory with reality. They honored the small rituals Jonas had cherished, the routine of feeding animals, the care of tools and fences, the walks through snow and wind. Each act became both homage and healing, a reclamation of life from the shadow of loss. The emotional landscape shifted slowly, tempered by understanding, yet enriched by the profound humanity of a man whose life had been ordinary in routine, extraordinary in depth. And the town of Cody, while never forgetting the rupture that had occurred, carried forward the story as both caution and testament. Children learned the importance of attentiveness and care. Neighbors maintained vigilance without paranoia. The landscape itself, once merely familiar, was now imprinted with memory. The Shoshone forest, the fences, and the pastures all retained echoes of Jonas Walker's presence, enduring markers of resilience, love, and quiet dedication. The resolution of Jonas' case did not erase grief, but it allowed it to settle into a form that could be acknowledged, mourned, and remembered. Every detail of his life, the subtle anxieties, the steadfast routines, the deep bonds with family and dog, gained resonance in the context of the full narrative, elevating his story from the shadow of mystery into the illumination of human experience. The ordinary became extraordinary not through spectacle, but through intimacy, vulnerability, and the enduring echoes of a life interrupted. And when you're ready, click the video on the right to explore another case.